do want to emphasize one thing. He has over 500 publications and has organized or give the lecture over 600, and he has numerous awards. So without further ado, I'm gonna give the floor to Dr. Sweedler. Come on.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Well, it's been a very fun and interesting session, very different talks, and I've learned a lot. And so we've heard about companies, people who have changed careers many times. I thought I would pick what I've done. I've been a faculty for 30-something years, and so I was going to talk a little bit about what it's like as you go through your career as a faculty member, and keeping the job fun. So this sort of fits what we heard a little bit in the last talk. I also normally use about 80 or 90 slides in a 20-minute talk, and so I only have about 12 to 14. Hopefully we'll have a chance for some questions at the end. And so one of the things, I've been a mentor to many new faculty, and usually they ask questions about how to get students into the group, how to manage the group, how to write proposals. I can tell you I have been on our campus's proposal writing workshops for new faculty for about 18 of the last 20 years. I'm not going to talk anything about that. There are critical skills, obviously, as a faculty member. But really another question is, and this is asked to me by junior faculty, mid-career, and others, is how do you keep on reinventing yourself so the job is fun? One of the interesting things I've learned is when I talk to people, they like to change job titles and they like the job to grow. And as a faculty member, obviously you go to an assistant professor to an associate professor, you get tenure and then you become a full professor, and then what? Your title doesn't change the rest of your career. Okay, you can get a chair or some fancy name after it. I've been a department head, a school director, and I don't think of myself as an administrator, I'm a faculty. So you have to keep yourself excited and new, not by changing careers. And there's a lot of different ways you can think about that. And then also the question is, how do you keep on adding extra jobs like being an editor without giving up others? So just one slide of who I am. Roughly, I just actually hadn't really thought about it this way. I've had about 75 PhDs, students. If you add the current ones, you can see sort of how big my group has been. I was really surprised to add up the number of postdocs. The reason the postdocs are quite large is because they tend to be 2 years as opposed to the 5 years of a graduate student. And so this is sort of what I've done. I was thinking about companies and in the last talk, and these 8 versus 7 versus 8 versus 9 is, I guess I should ask you could ask the question, if you've published 200 papers, why do 201 or 202? We keep on doing that. There are different topics, but it really doesn't end in that sense. It actually is also, I did a really rough count, but it's kind of scary when I realize that there's been, since I've been editor-in-chief, over 50,000 manuscripts. Don't ask me about yours, I don't remember all 50,000. Maybe that's because I'm over 60, but I think it's just because the numbers are large. I will say one of the interesting things this year, for example, last year we had the greatest number of papers ever submitted to Analytical Chemistry. January was the month that had the most papers in our history. This is really great, and it's also really scary because that job just keeps on growing, not really because I'm doing anything, because the journal just gets a little bit bigger. So, really what it comes down to, and we heard a little bit about this, is, time management. And doing this in a way that we're deliberative, and we pick, as we just heard about, the most important tasks. One of the interesting things, of course, is, all the duties that a faculty does, and how we allot the time is really the most important way and way we can be successful. And, I've been asked many times, as you become a department head, for example, or school director, or you take on a journal responsibilities, people ask me, what are you quitting? What are you stopping? And it's kind of strange because, of course, I'm not really sure how to answer that. I try to become more efficient. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And this is probably the area that's most important. I can get more money. I can actually have a larger group, but really time is the ultimate limited resource. I guess I would say a little bit I disagree with the last speaker in the sense there are some jobs that are impossible. And there are some jobs that we have control over. And one of the things that's impossible, if somebody, you don't really get more than 24 hours in a day, that's sort of the limited resource. And so how we work with that is important. And I liked, there's a couple of studies I've seen, and this is, one of the ones that I think that most of the speakers here would talk about is, establish clear expectations and goals. And that is probably the most important aspect of this, and especially for a job that has many possibilities. Now I'm going to go into one more part of this, and I think it's interesting. Most people talk about separating work and life, but I really like this quote. This is a really nice series of websites that the University of South Carolina Career Center has on it. But set clear goals and how you want to run your life. When I was starting out, I had talking about kids, I had 2 young twins, and I decided I'd be home every day between 5:30 and 8. That's 12 and a half hours of the work week that I claimed. And then I would go back if I had to. What was interesting is that I was in 2 programs, neuroscience and in chemistry. Neuroscience had the weekly seminars where they did all business at 7 o'clock. That unfortunately missed that. And then chemistry faculty meetings were at 5. And so I just was missing most of them. They'd be there for 15 minutes. I had the department head come to me and says, I guess you're not going to get tenure if you don't show up to department meetings. And in my mind, I said, I guess I'm not getting tenure. I wasn't going to change my 12 and a half hours. Now, there's exceptions. If I had invited seminar speakers, of course I went out with them, and it wasn't 100%, but I just found it sort of annoying that it was expected that I couldn't take that time off. It was interesting, too, because when I explained why, eventually, things like this changed. And it wasn't just because of me, but I did have quite a few faculty tell me they were very happy to see this change. I basically look at it as I have a 9-to-5 job, and then I have a hobby, which is also my work, and if I want to go back in, I can, but I don't really appreciate, the deans calling meetings on, 10 o'clock at night. I just don't think that's really the way it should be. I can choose to do that. And so I set very clear goals in how I wanted to work, and I really have tried to fit those through. The other thing is, really work. Faculty, obviously there's certain things you have to do. Pick what's meaningful to you and actually work to make sure that you get to do the things that are important to you. And there's actually an amazing amount of flexibility in this type of job. My biggest problem, of course, is I guess I'm an analytical chemist, I'm an analytical scientist, and so what I want to do is try everything, and then after the fact decide what was worthwhile, and that's actually kind of hard to do. In other words, you want to try, do you want to spend 2 weeks traveling and to a country and giving 12 talks in 2 weeks? And I did that, and I found no, I don't want to do that. But that was 2 weeks that I probably shouldn't have done. And so you say yes to try things, and sometimes the yeses take too much time. And so maybe in some cases I should have realized that saying yes to certain things was not necessarily what I needed to do. Become more efficient. Now that's an easy thing to say, but it is possible, and that is, I know some people that spend, they tell me it takes 6 months to write a proposal, and perhaps that's true, but eventually it gets to the point where I work on proposals every day, a little bit, a few hours at a time, and it becomes much more efficient. I don't really worry, there's not times when I actually force myself to clear my entire day. I talk to a lot of assistant professors, and they seem to want to do the proposals when everything else is done. If that's an important part of what you're working on, then don't let yourself fall into that trap. I have learned a little bit about the way I work, and so what I tend to do in terms of time management, maybe less now that I'm a department head or a school director. Before that, is I discovered that I need large blocks of time. So I would try to work one day that was maybe 10 to 12 hours, and I would not even read email that day. I would not be distracted. And the next day I would have 8 hours, and I would meet with my students. Not that it isn't important, but it does interrupt long trains of thought. I would do my email. People would be quite surprised. Didn't you see my message yesterday? Why didn't you call me yesterday? No, that's the day I'm working on 2 papers and a proposal. Why would I call you yesterday? Today is the day I'm calling you. And I just really tried to fit through that. I also discovered I work a little bit better in the morning. And so, I also spend time trying to do things in terms of reading for pleasure, keeping up on news, but I tend to do those in the evening because I think, my mind is not quite ready to work on proposals and other things. The only exception to that, and maybe that's a scary thing to say, is when I'm done with everything else for the day, I spend a couple hours on the journal every day at night, and maybe I shouldn't do that if I'm not as efficient, but it's sort of a lot of journal editing is sort of a little more mindless. And so you figure out when you're good for being creative, when you're good for getting things done, and really fit that. One of the things that I have learned, I have one of my sons is a musician, and he tells me playing instruments doesn't make you better. What does make you better is picking on the areas you need to work on, practicing just those. And so he will play for many hours, but he says, for 2 or 3 hours a day, he really has to practice on certain skills to get better. And I also think that's sort of true with writing or preparing for talks. Just because you're giving talks doesn't make you get better. Just because you're writing proposals doesn't make you get better. And so figure out the areas that are your pain points and really deliberately work on them. If it's organization, if it's time management, if it's the fact that you spend too much time trying to read everything in a particular field before you can write, figure out ways around that. I work with a lot of students in the group that, I can have some students that can write a dissertation in 2 weeks after they've done all the papers that they've written along the way. And other students, it's a 6-month task. And those types of time management tasks, I try to work very hard to help people learn to be a little bit more efficient. Obviously, there's a limit to how fast you can do. I can tell you, I spent a lot of time for a while learning to read papers at the same time I was listening to seminars, and I would just switch my attention back and forth. And it got to the point I actually could write a page summary on the paper I read and on the talk. It is possible, but I realized when people see you reading, it completely destroys their attitude towards you. They didn't pay attention. So that was a worthless skill because I had to learn to undo that because people don't really appreciate you reading papers during their seminars. And so there are some things you want to think about. And again, as I keep on saying, schedule time for the most important tasks. And those important tasks really depends on the individual, but it's really, don't leave them for last. We heard about that also in the last talk. My pitfall, and it's one of the things, that a lot of people have, is I keep on adding projects. One of the things is I have appointments and graduate students in analytical chemistry and chemical biology, but also neuroscience, bioengineering, biochemistry, microbiology. There's reasons for that. I love these fields. That's a way, once you have an appointment, you can take students, you gain, but there is actually a cost in time. I do single cell measurements, and then, somehow measuring molecules became metabolomics or proteomics or lipidomics as fancy names. But every few years I add, new areas. I like making measurements, and I tend to think of cell-to-cell signaling molecules, but I had quite a few chemical engineers that tell me they're doing error-prone PCR, and they can easily introduce 100,000 to 200,000 to 1 million different errors in making a particular enzyme, and then they want to test which ones make a particular fatty acid. And they say, okay, I want you to do 100,000 measurements, and that's only for today. And, okay, you can say you can make really fast GC or LCMS. It doesn't work at that scale. So we came up with, projects on how to do mass spec measurements once per second, and even that's too slow. And it's been fun. It's a new project. All of a sudden, I'm trying to learn a new field. And as you do that, you have to really remove fields. And so you have to ask yourself deliberately, is this something worth doing, or is it just because the person was next to you? Now, with that said, if you look at papers, the most highly cited paper I have is, the two actually have to relate to honeybees. I think the honeybee genome and neuropeptides in the honeybee has over 2,000 sites. That happened because every day when I got a cup of coffee for a few years at noon, I would work on sea slugs and other animals, and the person who did honeybees was there for coffee, Gene Robinson, and he said, why don't you work on a honeybee? And I kept on saying, no, go away, no, go away. And finally it's like, okay, we're gonna do the honeybee brains. And the whole point of that is that way I can have coffee in peace. And that's actually sort of true, unfortunately, but it's, and so what do you do if you keep on adding projects? You have to end projects. Now, many people I know end projects that aren't working. That's obvious. You end projects that don't, work, but I actually find that's not, you're going to end them anyway. How do you end projects that are doing well? I did some work on nanoliter volume NMR. It worked really well. A couple graduate students, postdocs, we had NIH money, we had a science paper out. It was doing really well, and I thought about it and said, is it time to write a renewal proposal, 5 more years on this? The problem with that particular area is that it's own conferences. You have, the experimental NMR conference and others, there's a whole different literature, and I was getting more and more involved in mass spec at the time and a few other areas, and I said, I am not going to write a renewal. I just can't, because I have to add these others. And I've done that 3 or 4 times. We haven't done wavelength resolved fluorescence and Kalbi electrophoresis for a while, but it's actually really hard. Because then you see papers in the field that you second guess yourself. Maybe I should have stayed on it a few years. But I've done that, multiple times to sort of stop a field because I wanted to add other areas. And I will say in the NMR area, it wasn't a complete stop. A couple students wanted to start a company. It's not as many, but the company existed for a decade and sort of was bought out. And so it was a successful area, but it takes a lot of deliberation to consciously end a project. I have uncountable collaborations. Now that's a silly statement, but that's because I sometimes work with people who collect animals from a weird place, Fiji, and then when they don't get animals, you don't know how often that will be. But I actually, think hard about what type of collaborations, because collaborations take time. Are they balanced? That's an easy one, and that is, are they also contributing intellectually in a meaningful way? But the other thing I really decided is if they're not fun, I stop them. There's some pretty nice scientific collaborations that I have actually ended, just because when I deal with the group, when I deal with the advisor, it's just not as fun. Something about it isn't, yes, we can make it work. And so maybe the students will finish up, but then I sort of end it. I have others, Martha Gillette I've been working with for 20-something years, Paul Bowe and others, and they just are a lot of fun. Every time I talk to them, I learn something. And I keep them going, probably because of the science, but also because somehow it's just fun. And so when I tell people that, they think it's a little strange, as that's how you pick what you're going to work on. But really, and the ones that cause you stress, there's a few people that just don't have a style that fits mine, and that is if you work on a joint grant, they think if the grant is due at 10 p.m. or at midnight on March 1st, they should start sending me the forms. I guess this year would be on February 29th, leap year or something, and 2 hours before. I can't handle that. I want them in advance, and so whether it's stress for things like that or stress in terms of writing or others, pick what's fun. And pick what you think moves you, your work forward. And so these are sort of the rules that I've done. I have the option to do this because I have lots of options to collaborate and do science. I know some people that says I only get 1 or 2 ideas and I want to, use those as far as they can. If you have lots of ideas, then you sort of can pick and choose how you want to move forward. The other thing, have fun with research. When I started, actually every 2 years or so, I spent summers at Friday Harbor Marine Lab to learn. We collect animals, and I went to see how the brain evolved. And it's kind of fun. It's from corals to snails to sea urchin. They all use serotonin and dopamine and acetylcholine, and you discover that D-serine is a neuromodulator in a slug and a human. It's neurotransmitters. Some parts of the brain are very conserved. And so I would learn. When I was at Friday Harbor, people thought it was hilarious that this chemist was trying to learn to dissect individual cells. And people would collect the weirdest animals they possibly could and say, okay, you find these 3 cells. And had a lot of fun doing that. It's harder when you're a department head, but I just wrote a proposal with Lena Gross, a former postdoc who's now a professor in marine biology at Whitney Marine Lab. And it's to have a boat go around the world and collect more animals. In this case, seeing how 34 phyla and the nervous systems on those respond to the changing environment. We'll see if that gets funded, but it's down to 1 of 3. And so I just think that's a really fun, it's not curing a disease, it's how, which most people tend to think of, but it is actually something important in science, and it actually is just a lot of fun. And so pick what you think is fun, combine it with others. I don't know if I would get on a boat for 6 months of it as assistant professor. Maybe that would be good, I don't know. Then they can't find you to tell you don't have tenure. It might work. Might not work. Maybe that's not a good idea. So there's a lot of options here, but again, I hope I'm trying to convince you that especially if what you think is fun is, in this case, obviously no one will pay me to go around the world, or nobody would pay anybody unless you can get, convince a foundation or NSF to pay for it. And so, this is not you do have to convince to be deliberate in these types of projects. I've asked many times, talking to quite a few of the assistant professors in the department in terms of service for the profession. I oftentimes go to an assistant professor and say, what are your goals? And I listen for quite a bit. And then they tell me they're going to organize a conference, or they're going to do something that takes a lot of time, and it has nothing to do with any of their goals. And so the question is, if you're asked to do something, is it something that really fits in? Now, with that said, if you have a grant, I don't like writing progress reports, but you have to do it, right? There's certain things you have to do, and that's just part of life. If you publish papers, you need to review. If you submit your grant proposals, you should review. Now, I can tell you as an editor, I've gone around and I've had people tell me, I'm too busy to review. I haven't reviewed a paper in a decade. Sort of, I'm sorry, but it really kind of pisses me off. But they still get their papers published because, it's sort of a community thing. How much is expected? See if your load balances. This is sort of, doesn't have to every year. If 30% of the papers that you submit, in analytical chemistry are accepted, they all take 2 to 3 reviews, that would imply 6 to 8 reviews for every paper that gets published. Boy, that's a lot. But it's sort of as fair. If you're somebody who submits to 12 journals and they all get reviews, it would even be more. And so, this is my perspective as an editor, but it does mean you review a lot. Now, when I became an editor, I was reviewing over 100 papers a year, and I said, I'm going to review a lot less, so I cut it down to about 20, which isn't fair given my submission, but that's because I'm doing other aspects in terms of editing. So I review less than I used to. If you have appointments in different units, if you think about this, if a student joins my group and they have a prelim exam and a final exam, that is really, besides me, 6 faculties that are on their exams. So every student that joins my group, I should be on 6 different committees. Right? That would be fair. I know some faculty who don't do this. And so there's one bit, is what is fair. You can decide that. Everybody doesn't have to do it. But then after that, more maybe isn't needed. Service to the profession. Lots of committees help you on campus, and so you should be on a few committees. But, I've been asked to be on hundreds of committees, and I've only picked the ones that I think were fun. I was the director of the Biotech Center, and I took over the School of Chemical Sciences because they basically run a lot of the facilities on campus, mass spec, NMR, things like, sequencing, transgenic animals. But at least I said, this is something I could help in some ways. And so I very carefully have picked the type of areas that I would find more rewarding than others. And so I've been deliberate about that. Maybe, I've done more than I have to. To be honest, I'm only being acting department head for 1 year. Now it has to do more with hiring and dealing with, to be honest, I don't mind. I love working with students, but I don't know if I necessarily want to be the person who has all the problems that come up. And so, you get to decide how you want to spend the time, but I really, really suggest that you really think about this in a deliberative way. Service to the profession, I, again, pick things that I think are fun. I don't tend to like running meetings, and so I don't do that. Other people really find that enjoyable, and so I sometimes forget I don't like it, and I do it once a decade, and so now I remember why I didn't like to do that. And so I don't run too many meetings. I've been asked many, many times, and I just basically say no. A lot of my colleagues love that. Editor, you don't have to start out becoming, you probably wouldn't make it as an editor of a journal unless you've been on advisory boards, and then you could actually maybe be an associate editor. I pretend it takes 18 hours a week. It's probably more than that sometimes for every week of the year. Strangely enough, I've learned something sort of interesting, and that is scientists in general, analytical chemists for sure, can't go on a vacation until they submit their paper. So you can tell when there's a large vacation. The number of papers from China skyrockets right before, of course, the new year. You can tell when France is going in August because right before that, or right as it starts, the number of papers from France go up. It's like, oh, it's the French holiday. It's really annoying as an editor because then the first thing you do is you're like, oh, I can ask them to review. And of course, they all say no because we're on vacation. But, and it's true also in this country, more papers come in right as the school year ends, in December. You have a break, you're no longer doing other things, and so you finish your paper. So, this is, one of the things. But being an editor is a lot of fun. I would say, the most interesting thing is, I say strange interactions with authors. You go to a seminar, give a talk at an apartment, and somebody says, I gotta talk to you, slams the door shuts and start yelling at you for rejecting a paper. And it wasn't even one I necessarily dealt with, but somebody else did. So electrochemistry paper that the electrochemistry that somehow editor handled, 5 years ago, but they have to tell me all about it. So, I'm just giving you that as a funny thing about being an editor. The one thing I don't really like is that the 1 in 1,000 event that's unethical happens 6 or 7, 8 times a year because we get 6,000 plus papers a year. And that's the least favorite time. I don't want to necessarily deal with that, but unfortunately when you're the editor, then there's no one else to pass it off to. So those are the bad things. The good things is you really stay up on the field. I find it very rewarding. It's really fun to see how publishing works. So these are the questions that I suggest you ask, when you consider taking on a large job. And I say that because, again, when I've asked a lot of people how they make these choices, they basically say it was luck or random. And that's fine, maybe, but it seems like a strange way to run your life. You know, to basically say, well, you know, this just happened or this just happened. You know, and so be deliberative and really ask what it is that you think would keep you going for a long time. You know, this is the group that's kept me going. I see a couple of them in the audience. You know, and so you can see they like to make as fun of me as I do with, you know, I guess they're making fun of my hair, and at least one of them on April Fool's Day. And, you know, I hope we never get group meetings again that look like that Zoom meeting, but, you know, we get to have surprises in their life too. So this was short enough that I think we have time for a few questions on any topic you want. I really, you know, this is one of these open-ended type assignments. Talk about, you know, what it is about your career that could be useful to others in terms of how you make choices. And so it's really been interesting to see how 4 different people took this in such different directions. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Great talk. Any questions? No?
How did you learn when and how to say no?
Some would say I never learned to say no. That's the problem. It depends, you know. So one of the things I did is you know, you say yes to traveling to give talks, and I guess my research, other things were going well enough. By my 5th or 6th year, I was gone. You know, this is even before tenure. I had 80 to 100 days of travel, and it got up to 110 or 120, and it was ridiculous. And so finally, I said, I will take 1 trip in any 1 month, and the second trip has to be strategic, meaning it's NIH is telling me to go out or do something. So the first trip, I don't care. The second one has to be, and never a third. And so it got to the point where somebody said, "Hey, can you give a talk?" And he said, "Let me look. I guess that would be, you know, 18 months from now." And then people, you know, don't respond. They actually wait a year and then ask me again. It's still 18 months. So I came up with rules to say no that in my mind I didn't have to think as much about. And of course, there's always exceptions. But I worked really hard. My travel sort of went down from 120 days to about 60, and that seemed to be a much more manageable, you know. And so you learn sometimes as a self-defense. I made an assumption that when graduate students wanted to join my group, it would get too big, it would become chaotic, and no one would want to join the group, right? So it would be self-limiting. It could be money, but it could be just beyond my ability to manage it well, and that would prevent people from joining. I discovered that graduate students had more of a tolerance for chaos than I did. So in other words, that didn't work. I had 20-something students at one point. I know Lingjun and Lee and Dick Zare did that, but I couldn't handle that. And so then I had to learn to, someone will say no, but I can't pick a good graduate student from a bad one in the sense that I think I can, but it never works out. So then it's really hard. Do you do it first come, first served? Do you do it other ways? Do you just become a little less approachable? I'm still learning how to deal with that, because I like having students in the group and it's fun, but at some point, you know, there's a time resource, and so I am still learning how to keep some parts of the job manageable, but I'm really striving to stay at about 12 students. Good question.
Jonathan, I have kind of a stupid question.
Those are always hard.
So you said you have 2 areas that you work on. One is neuroscience, the other one is chemistry. In your opinion, which are the really big deal in both of these ones? Which is the real big direction?
Well, you know, so neuroscience is a hard one because I actually find it strange. You know, everybody always wants to know about disease, and first off, obviously, we need to know more about a lot of, you know, mental illnesses, depression we don't understand. You know, there's a lot of important questions about, you know, surprisingly poor progress has been made on Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and others. So those are all important. But I also find it strange that, you know, Aristotle said, "What is consciousness?" And he kind of proposed a few possibilities, and we still don't know what that is. So what is, you know, how does the brain work in health? There's some questions. What is memory? You know, you can go to a fruit fly that's learned to eat starch versus simple sugars. And can you take the fruit fly brain with a cryo-EM or maybe with, you know, analytical chemistry approaches and say, is there something in those brains that I can see the difference between them to understand what leads to that? And to be honest, that part of it also I find very exciting. And so those are big questions. It's easy to come up with important areas in neuroscience in the sense that there's so much we don't know, right? And so until we've cured, you know, the problems with, you know, we make everybody age healthily, you know, so we get rid of some of those problems and others. I think there's a lot with neuroscience that I can name. In chemistry, That's a really good question. In terms of analytical chemistry, mass spectrometry, other areas have gotten amazingly powerful. It's pretty easy now with an instrument. I work with Rohit Bhargava, and between us we've done Raman imaging at really high resolution and mass spec imaging, and another publisher says we'll put any amount of data in the supplemental information. So Rohit and I turned it in and said, this is 6 terabytes of data, would you put it in supplement? I said, no. And so you can collect more data than we know what to do with, and this wasn't that many images. And so another problem is, how do you deal with the fact that you can acquire tens of terabytes, hundreds of terabytes of data, and how do you extract the data? And that's a field that most of us weren't trained in. And so it's informatics, it's machine learning, AI, whatever you want to roll it into. We're able to collect data at a level that's pretty staggering. And using the data most efficiently to extract the information we need still is an area that needs a lot of work. And so that's, I would say, a big area for the field. We're certainly grappling how to work with AI, and both in science and otherwise. And so there's a lot of fun areas. These are challenges and a lot of fun. Obviously, there's still a lot of advances in many other areas. What I like about analytical chemistry, the field, is that I think I know what's going to happen, and somebody comes up with something completely different. Mass spectrometry is getting better and better, and yet I wouldn't be surprised if one of these times somebody comes up with nanopore sequencing of proteins at the single molecule level, for example, that just simply says, we don't need that stuff, we're going to do it this way. Or, and so the crazy advances are also just a lot of fun.
How do you tell your collaborators that you want to end the collaboration, and how have they taken it?
So if a student is involved, you try to end at a good time period. So you don't end, you don't get one sample and say, no, I'm actually bored and I quit. And so you usually, most collaborations, there's 2 students. And so they might finish a set of experiments, and the collaborator might say, okay, can we try something else? And you might say, no, this is enough, let's just finish this and get the paper out. And then you see what happens. Sometimes, so it really depends. Some collaborations, may involve, medical doctors or others, and then they end in different ways. But I never will do it in such a way that if we made a promise to do some things, and I have a student running samples, or they, you end it. I sort of get really frustrated when I have a student who's gotten a couple samples to make everything work, and then the person says, oh, I'm moving on. Because that doesn't seem fair to the students. And so the first thing, you always protect them. And so you pick natural points to end the collaboration, if that makes any sense.
Just a quick comment. It's a great talk, thank you. And it's very impressive. You manage so well, so many responsibilities. And also it's very amazing, I noticed, that not just managing all those responsibilities, but same time you can still keep your hair, your beard, and your mustache.
It's turning gray. It's turning
You
gray.
have to do every day. How much time? Does it take more time to trim than shaving? Look at it.
I can tell you. I can tell I can make the joke that when I was 10 years old, I got hit by lightning and it curled, and that was the last. I do that.
Huh?
That is not a question I expected.
But you have to do every day, right?
No.
You don't?
No.
Oh.
I'm lazy.
It's better than shaving.
Much better.
Are you thinking about changing your style?
I did keep my beard one time for a few days, but everyone said, oh, that's not good, so I have to shave it.
See, if you spend a summer at Friday Harbor Marine Lab, you need to have a beard, or the people that are collecting animals don't take you seriously.
You don't have to trim every day, that's good. I have to shave every day, so I take no time. But, okay, I'll
See, that can save you 5 minutes a day. Look at, you could probably submit one more paper. By the way, if you want to know the crazy things, this is actually true. If you do informatics and look at literally millions of papers that are submitted to most of the major publishers, you discover that the acceptance rate is a little bit lower if the paper is submitted on a weekend. Probably because the editors are grumpy on either Sunday or Monday. I don't know. This is true of other fields, but it actually adds up. So that if you submit 5 papers a year for 30 years, you will have about 4 to 5 less papers published in your career. So if you want to know ways to be more successful, just submit your papers on Wednesday.
Did you do statistic analysis?
What? I did not do that. This was actually, some informatics people looked at this. There's things about selling socks and doing other things, not on Mondays, but I thought this was funny on papers because I wouldn't have thought that we were that influenced, and it's not a huge. And there also is, if you want more citations, it turns out, no matter what you like in terms of your title, shorter titles have a slightly higher impact, more citations. And so in general, short titles submitted on a Wednesday for your papers will do better. And so there you go, that's the real secret, but I don't know if.
We have a question.
So you've been in Illinois your whole career, and besides the obvious charms of Champaign-Urbana, what's factored into your decision to stay there?
So when I moved there, I grew up in California. I thought I would stay there for 5 or 6 years and move. It's a great town in terms of, I walk into work, I walk back, it's a mile away. My son is a musician. Let me tell you this, since we're in San Diego. And a few years ago, he bought a house, and it's not a big house. It's 750 square feet with a full basement, and the house was $91,000. His principal and interest are $450 a month. And so, my kids have stayed there. Even as a musician, he's traveling around and he's in other places now, but, you can live differently. And you can visit anywhere you want. So in that sense, it's all ridiculous because when somebody moves into the street, everybody bakes them, zucchini bread and a pie and brings them over. I feel like I'm in the 1950s. So that's fun. But now, the other problem now is if you want to think of it, I'm 63, let's just pretend I have 7 years. I don't know, I'm just saying 70 is a time. It could be any length of time I'm going to be active as a faculty. If it takes 1 or 2 years to get a group established somewhere else, do I really want to spend 2 years of my, and that's true if it was a decade or more. There has to be a good reason. And one of the things that I have done is I've established some amazing long-term collaborations on campus and in the area, and then there would have to be a reason why. So all of those kind of blend in. I never thought I'd be somebody who stayed at the same place for that long, but it's worked out. Or I'm just lazy and don't feel like moving. It's one or the other.
How to make a choice for a career for like an early career like a PhD students? Because every career like industry or academia has its own pros and cons. But before stepping into that, it's very difficult to know from that inside. So like what should we consider when are we trying to graduate or something?
That's it. What do you want to do with your life and how do you do that? That's a really good question. There's 2 things I'm going to answer. First off though, is no decision you make is irrevocable. And so you could decide to go into academics and move to industry. I have a person who has spent about 4 years in industry and decided to come back as a postdoc so they can go into academics. You can change. It might cost you some extra time as opposed to knowing right away. And there's harder times to change. So you have control over that. It depends on what you want to do. I personally have a personality, I guess I would say, that most of the time I don't like people telling me what to do. And so I thought maybe starting in a company would be problematic. Now obviously that, if you're starting a company, there's a lot of things you have to do that maybe people aren't telling you to do, and you just know they have to be done. And so I thought academics would work well, right? And so I can tell you though, out of the 150 graduates and postdocs, half go into pharma, writ large, small companies to large. About 25% are in some form of academics, and 25% are in anything from running a children's museum to, doing other things. And so you get to choose, but you have to decide what it is that you want to do. And what I try to do is make sure people know what the job will be like to the best of my ability. But you have to make that choice and ask people. I would actually add one last thing about academics: is if you are phenomenally good at something in industry, really good at problem solving on the bench, if you're good as a manager, you can go into that track. To succeed in academics, you sort of are a small company on your own. And so you have to be able to write your own grants, manage your own group, and give talks, convince people to fund you, all of these things. And so your success will sort of be based on the worst of any of those abilities, right? If you can do most of them well, but not all of them, then you really, really hate to write proposals, or somehow managing graduate students makes you sick to the stomach, then maybe that's not the way to go. Because academics is really just a small company. You don't get the department saying, you're doing great, let me write your proposals for you. So that you have to look into yourself and say, what is it? There's positives and negatives about this, and what fits my particular personality to decide which way to go. If that makes sense.
Any other questions? lunchtime.
Yes.
So thank you, everyone, to stay so long for lunch. So, thank you. No words. So the speaker, you can come back to speaker. The speaker